reason why we are in the garden today is because we have some sunshine today. Actually, as we speak, the sun's gone behind the clouds. I clearly got overexcited. Oops, a train coming. Yes, I live by the train tracks. I didn't time it right, did I? Let's try this again. Hello, amazing humans on the net. Welcome to my video in which I want to talk to you about all the books I read in the month of January. We are in February. It is still really cold, but we have this glorious sunshine today, which here in England we haven't seen for many weeks now, and it feels amazing. So this is why we're here. Anyway, so January was a very good reading month for me. Obviously, all that gloomy weather is great for staying home and reading books. I read 7 books. Some of them are short novellas, so I guess this is why I read more than usual. I usually read about 5-6 books per month. And by the way, I'm very well set up here. I've got my books. I don't have all of the books I read because some of them I listen to as an audiobook. I have my notebook with the notes I have written about the books I've read, and I also have, to keep me nice and warm, a thermos with a hot tea in there. So I'm well set. So the first book I read in January was this one, which is The Wolf Border by Sarah Hall. In case you can't see the cover that well, because I'm sitting quite far apart from the camera, I will link all the titles below. I have to open my notebook. This is a perfect winter read because even though it is set across all the seasons, for some reason the winter in this book seems the longest. It is a very harsh, cold, long winter here in England, and even on the cover of the book you've got this very snowy picture of the forest and of a wolf. So if you are a seasonal reader, then I would highly recommend to read this book in the winter time. Got this mix of beautiful lyrical nature descriptions, which are sort of a backdrop to the main story of the main character, Rachel, as she goes through this, you could say, transformation in her life. She's in her late 30s. She very deliberately distanced herself from her family, with whom she has extremely complicated and difficult relationship, especially with her mother, to the point where she left the country and moved to the US. But something happens. Plus, she is offered this new job, and so she returns to England. And so we watch her going through this process of facing her past, facing her demons, reconciling with her past and with her family as well. So she returns to her homeland, to northern England, because she is hired by this wealthy English aristocrat to rewild wolves on his estate. This is supposed to be sort of his latest whim. But as you read the story, there's a bit more depth to it. And actually, there are quite a few political references in this book. So if this is something you enjoy, you'll enjoy this book. One of those references is that in this book, we live in a world in which Scotland voted for independence. I loved the premise of this story. I have never read a book in which a key character would specialize in wolves. Very fascinating and educational, I guess, side effect of this book was that I learned a lot about wolves and wolf packs. I picked up this book because another wonderful YouTuber, and I will link her channel below if you're interested, mentioned this book in comparison to The Paper Palace. And she said, whoever enjoyed The Paper Palace will enjoy this book as well. I am in that category. I loved The Paper Palace, and I would definitely agree with this opinion because you also have here in this book nature playing a very key part in the book. You also have this eerie, actually not eerie, but more like tantalizing world and tantalizing style of writing as well. I will definitely read this author's other book, which is titled, hold on, I wrote it down, The Electric Michelangelo. So yes, overall, it's probably one of the better books I read recently. I do have one gripe with this book, and it's got nothing to do with the writing, it's got nothing to do with the story. It is the spelling and grammar mistakes that you can find in this particular edition of the book. I don't know who the editor was, but they had one job. Do you know what I mean? One job. I have marked them because I couldn't believe them. I had to go back to these pages to double check whether I'm just not dreaming it up. You've got one page here, and I'll show it to you on the screen, but on page 223, you have the article "the" mentioned twice. Oh, you have another sentence, page 34, so in the beginning of the book. The Highland studies are speculative. I know. I advised on one them. This obviously was supposed to be, I know, I advised on one of them. But there you go. If you can find a different edition of this book, this was published by Faber and Faber. I don't know if there's another edition, but I hope they're gonna reprint this because the book is really good. It's just that I personally find these sort of mistakes extremely off-putting and really affecting my reading experience. After The Wolf Border, I read The Handmaid's Tale. Really, really well known modern classic. Recently, there has also been a Netflix adaptation. In case you haven't read the book and haven't seen the Netflix series, this is set in a dystopian future where we have a totalitarian system in which women are slaves to the ruling elite and they are forced to bear children for them. It's not really clearly explained why we live in a world in which women are infertile, but that's not really the point of the story. The point of the story is that totalitarian system, and like in any of them, you've got the oppression, you've got the secret police, and you've got a very strict hierarchy system. This is beautifully told in the form of a diary of one of those women slaves. And because it is told in the form of a diary, which I thought was very cleverly done by Margaret Atwood, we are learning not only of just the events, but also of the thoughts of the main character and her emotions. I was bracing myself for this book because I read 1984 by Orwell in December, and I was just thinking, oh my goodness, another dystopian novel. Let's get ready. But I must say, it didn't affect me nowhere near as much as 1984. What did affect me actually more than the story itself is the epilogue in the book. And it's not even what happens in the epilogue, but it's the tone of the epilogue. So the epilogue is set in even further future, something like in the 22nd century. And we have a bunch of researchers and professors who discover this diary. Again, very clever move from Margaret Atwood to add something like this to the book because I feel like there's a lot of hidden meaning in that epilogue. I think Atwood almost makes this sort of a commentary on the academics and how not always abstaining from moral judgment when it comes to assessing a culture is the right thing to do, especially if that culture is totalitarianism. Anyway, I don't want to say any more because I don't want to spoil it for you, but make sure if you read the book to read the epilogue as well. It is really, really important. I'm really glad I read it. In fact, if you are trying to get to reading classics and you don't mind starting with a modern classic and you enjoy dystopian novels, then maybe this would be the right choice for you. After The Handmaid's Tale, I read The Belger by Sylvia Plath. I already talked about that book in my New Year Reset video, where I do a bit of a deep dive into some of the philosophical questions contained in that book. So if you're interested, please go ahead and watch that video. I highly also recommend the recording by Maggie Gyllenhaal, which is available on Audible. She did a stunning job of that. And I think it was the narration that just made me enjoy this book so much more than if I was reading it on paper. It is a bit of a depressing read. It does cover mental health issues. So do look up trigger warnings if you need to. But it's also very much a complex commentary on societal norms and those norms that especially restrict women. One other thing I forgot to mention in my previous video where I talked about the bell jar is that even though the book is quite serious and often depressing, it is also a lot of the times quite funny. The reason why I remember this now is because in my notebook I read this quote from the book, which I personally found extremely funny. It says, "He had what no American man I've ever met has had, and that's intuition." I don't know why I found it so funny, but to me, that's very, very funny. And that is the sort of writing that you're faced with in this book. It's very descriptive, very smart, very witty, and very poignant. If you haven't read the book, I highly recommend it, and especially do check out Maggie Gyllenhaal's narration on Audible. The next two books I read in January found their spot in my Valentine's books video. The first one was a collection of short stories by Huma Qureshi, which I do have here, titled Things We Do Not Tell the People We Love. Again, go back to my Valentine's special to hear more about these short stories. Amazing writing. I think Huma Qureshi is quickly becoming one of my favorite writers. I read her Playing Games novel back in December. I really enjoyed it. And so this is a collection of short stories centered around love, but around love between different relations. So sometimes it's a husband and wife, sometimes it's a mother and daughter, sometimes it's a couple of female friends. And each one beautifully captures all the nuances of those relationships, which I think is sometimes very difficult to do with short stories. But I think it's due to Qureshi's writing. It's so smooth. It's almost as if you read, you just glide over the pages. It doesn't feel like reading. It is beautiful. And my favorite story is Superstitious, which is about this widow and her grief. And I loved how the author intertwined a fable into this short story. Go check it out. The other book that also found its spot in my Valentine special was Carmilla, which is a gothic novella. It's a Victorian, very sensual novel about a female vampire. It does predate Dracula. It was published 25 years before Dracula. And I'm just really upset that not more people know about it. Oh, another train. Whoops. This may be potentially my last video in the garden. Where were we? Carmilla, yes. Go and watch my Valentine's special because I talk about this book a bit more in there. I loved it. It's not like your typical vampire story because there is not much action, but instead you have this passionate, deep attraction between two women. And the fact that actually one of them is a vampire is almost like, I don't know, it feels like a side story to me anyway. A couple of things I really appreciated in that novella, which I hadn't mentioned in my previous video, was that subtle philosophical discourse on religion versus nature. There is a section in the book in which one of the women, who is the vampire, is in a conversation with another character who talks about religion, and she goes into this monologue which I thought was quite interesting. And there's another subtle discourse on love, as in, should we reject love just because it comes to us in a form that we are unfamiliar with, or should we accept it because it's love and therefore love is always pure? So yes, a vampire gothic story, but with some depth to it as well. So that was my fifth book. And then I read Mario Benedetti's Who Among Us. This is a book that was on my Classics TBR for 2025. So I'm very pleased with myself because actually so was The Handmaid's Tale and The Wolf Border was on my fiction TBR list. I am plowing through my TBR list. Anyway, so this is a short novella by a writer who comes from Uruguay. He does have Italian surname, but that's because he was born to two Italian immigrant parents. He was first and foremost a poet. He did have to leave the country due to political reasons. I think he did return to Uruguay towards the end of his life. But this novella has got nothing to do with politics, at least I think. This is a novella about a love triangle. We've got Miguel, we've got Alicia, and we've got Lucas. Miguel and Alicia are married, they've got two children, but they also friends with Lucas, and they have been friends with Lucas for years and years, since they were practically in school. The first part of the book is told from the perspective of Miguel. This is also the longest part of the book. And we get to meet this Miguel, who is very much insecure and who deep down doesn't believe that Alicia really loves him. He doubts it so much that he is almost the one who pushes Alicia into Lucas's arms. There's a great quote from the book on the back of the cover which says, "My dearest, our marriage has not been a failure, but something far more terrible, a misspent success." Really gorgeous writing. Anyway, so we do get Alicia's perspective, which is in the second part of the book, but that is much, much shorter. And then we also have Lucas's perspective, which is even shorter, but very cleverly done because he, in this book, is a writer and his perspective is done in a way where you've got his version of events described as part of his novel, but then you've got the footnotes at the bottom of each page where he notes down his thoughts. And so you don't know until the end really what actually happened, what actually was said. So, for example, he would say in one of those footnotes something like, "That's not what actually Alicia said, but that's what I think she meant." Or he would say something like, "That's not what I did, but I wished I did it." Never seen anything like this before. I thought that was very clever, but because of it, you don't really get that black and white resolution to the story, which is fine by me. I don't always need it. The reason why I'm not crazy about this book is because I felt like it didn't dig deep enough into the characters and the story itself. I felt like this is one of those books that leaves you sitting on the edge of it or not feeling invested into the story and characters. So I would say, even though this is a modern classic, if you're trying to get into classics, I can't say I recommend this book. I just realized that I forgot to bring the book that I wanted to talk to you about the most. 1 second. So this is the book I really wanted to focus on today. This is The Driver's Seat by Muriel Spark. It's a modern classic. It was recommended to me by my very first subscriber. This was a ride. Again, I have to reach for my notes because I've written so much about this book. So this is what I've written. Disturbing and fascinating at the same time. Surprising, risky, bizarre. So we follow main character Lisa, who is this 30 something, I think she's in her late 30s, woman who for the last 16 years had the same office job, and then one day she goes on holiday. From the first page of the book, you know something is off. She behaves somewhat erratically. So, the first page of the book is set in a store where Lisa is trying to buy a dress, and as she tries on this dress, which she really likes, the shop assistant tells her that this dress is also great, not just because it's pretty, but also it is made from anti-stain material. And this main character, Lisa, gets really upset about that for some reason, and she demands that the dress needs to be taken off her immediately. And so we don't really understand why she behaves like that, but throughout the book, as you keep reading, you've got several other events like this one where her reactions and some of the things she says we just don't really get. You do get a conclusion to all of this at the end of the story, which is great. And I think with this book, it wouldn't work if you didn't. It's just that the conclusion that you get, it's not something you would expect from your typical psychological thriller. I have never read anything like this before. And actually, I don't know if I would call it a psychological thriller. It's more of an obscure psycho slash existential book. Oh, and by the way, another key thing that you find out very early in the novella, and this is not a spoiler, by the way, because this is mentioned several times from very early pages, is that you know that Lisa will be found dead the next day. This is a brilliant hook that just makes you keep reading. So yes, this novella will definitely mess with your head. If you enjoy the type of characters that are unhinged, this book is for you. However, do prepare yourself for a bit of a ride with this one because you won't get that typical resolution to the story that an average logical mind would expect to get. The theme that is in there is very dark, but it is told at times in a humorous manner. And I think actually one of the things that one must appreciate in this book is how Muriel Spark doesn't seem to be even pretending that at any point she is attempting to set the story in reality. This is very much an obscure and absurd novel, and as much as it does make you want to go back for more because you're hungry for what's next and you are craving that resolution, I thought that overall the characters were slightly too absurd for me. So I'm glad I've read it, and thank you for the recommendation, because this book made me venture into an entirely new category. But this is one of those books that is very much out there. I did enjoy the writing, and I might actually read other Muriel Sparks novels because I have heard that this one is the most obscure. And there is a movie based on this novel with Elizabeth Taylor, who apparently did a stunning job as the main character, Lisa. So if I find myself in the right mood, I might watch it. One other thing that I thought was very clever was the title of the book, which will make sense to you after you've read it. It's a great metaphor for how much control we human beings have. I am not sure if I'm selling this book very well, but I am sure that there's an audience for it. If you are planning to watch the movie, I would say read the book first because of the ending. I think you want to find out about it from the book first before seeing the movie. So we're finishing up indoors because my battery died, and this time round I was completely unprepared and I didn't have my spare battery ready. So by the time I'm filming this, the sun's gone back behind the clouds. It got very cold, so I thought I would say goodbye to you from the inside of my house. Now, I do want to introduce a bit of a new tradition to my monthly wrap-up videos, and that tradition will be very much related to my absolute love for the English language. As someone who is not an English native speaker, I find the English language absolutely fascinating and one of the most beautiful in the world. And I know lots of people say that it's French for them or Italian, but for me, English sounds like singing sometimes. You know, when you think about all these words like coincidence or disappointed, I really think it sounds like music to my ears anyway. And maybe that's because my native language is Polish, which is known for its harshness. There are lots of zh, sh. So I guess against that, English will sound like singing. But anyway, I love it. And what I love to do is discover words that I haven't come across yet, or I have come across but wouldn't think to use on everyday basis just because they used a little bit less. And so in each of these videos, I will end it with an interesting word that ideally I will have found in one of the books I read that month. And if I couldn't find an interesting word in there, then I would just do some research and present one for you. And so for this month, I want to mention the word that I've seen used not once, but several times in the novel Carmilla, which I think was perfectly suitable to the description of the main character Carmilla, and that word is languid. I don't know about you, but I have not heard anyone use it in real life. I don't know whether it's because it's quite an old-fashioned word. And so I've looked it up in the dictionary, and Cambridge Dictionary explains languid means moving or speaking slowly with little energy, often in an attractive way. Bingo! Perfect adjective to describe female vampire, right? I should probably include the definition in American Dictionary, which says lacking energy or causing a lack of energy or enthusiasm. So kind of similar, but without the angle of having less energy, but in an attractive way. So there you go. Languid is the word of the month. That's it. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please let me know what book discoveries you made in January and which ones you enjoyed the most. And as usual, I will see you next week in my next video. Bye for now.